Hello, my friend, in this quiet space. When we close our eyes and think of the Middle Ages, our minds are often seated with beautiful images. We see summer fairs bustling with laughter, knights in gleaming armor participating in grand tournaments, and castle halls warmed by the glow of 1,000 candles. It is a colorful picture, a chapter of history we often view through a romantic lens. But that is only half of the story. That is the story of summer. Tonight, I want to invite you to turn to another chapter, a forgotten one, written in the language of frosted breath and endless nights. This is the story of winter. In the Middle Ages, winter was not a season. It was a great challenge, a stern teacher who visited each year, bringing with it a profound and daunting stillness. And for 99% of the population, the ordinary peasants, the question each sundown was not, "What's for dinner?" but, "How do we not freeze before morning?" Let us imagine together a small hut, huddled in the middle of a frost-covered field. Its walls are not built of sturdy stone, but woven from branches and plastered with a mixture of mud and straw. The roof is thatched, and the cold wind seeps through every crack like invisible fingers. Inside, the cold is not a sensation. It is an entity. It crawls up from the damp earth floor. It radiates from the walls, and it makes the small, sputtering fire in the center of the room seem fragile and alone. In that space, a family is gathered. They do not have goose-down duvets or modern heating. They have only a few coarse woolen tunics, the breath from their own lungs, and a quiet belief that tomorrow the sun will rise. The question arises, how did they possibly survive? How, in such a harsh environment, without technology, without the most basic of comforts, did they not only live but also raise families, tell stories, and keep the flame of life burning for centuries? This is not a story of misery, but of incredible wisdom. A story not of deprivation, but of the boundless creativity born from it. The answer lies not in suits of armor or in swords. It lies in the most ordinary of secrets, in knowledge passed from one generation to the next like a precious heirloom. It is hidden in the art of banking a single glowing ember so it can last through the night. It is in the decision to bring livestock into the home to share their warmth. It is in the surprising wisdom of keeping clothes a little dirty to improve their insulation. And it is in the warmth of a heated stone, a small miracle in the middle of a frozen night. Tonight, we will not speak of kings or their great deeds. We will speak of the anonymous heroes, the artisans of survival. We will explore the ingenious strategies, the unbreakable community bonds, and the strength of the human spirit when faced with its greatest challenge. So, let your body rest. Let your breath become even. Our journey into the heart of the medieval winter is not to feel the chill, but to find the warmth. We will discover that even in the longest, coldest nights, the flame of life, of human connection, and of ingenuity always burns bright. And that light, perhaps, will warm even us right here, right now. And that light, perhaps, will warm even us right here, right now. The first secret to their resilience is not found in any grand miracle. It lies in the very place they called home. To us, a house is a place of comfort. To them, a house was the first line of defense in the long confrontation with the cold, a humble fortress built from what the earth provided and from a wisdom passed down through generations. Forget walls of flat brick and perfect paint. The wall of a medieval hut is a work of art born from survival. Historians call it wattle and daub. Wattle is a frame cleverly woven from pliable branches like willow or hazel, creating a sturdy lattice. Daub is the true miracle. It is a mixture plastered onto that frame, consisting of clay soil, chopped straw for durability, water, and a secret ingredient that modern sensibilities might find alarming, but was incredibly effective: animal dung. Dried cow or horse manure acted as a miraculous binding agent, keeping the mud mixture from cracking as the weather changed. It also had mild antibacterial properties and was, most importantly, entirely free. This wall was not perfectly sealed. It breathed. It allowed moisture to escape slowly, preventing the indoor air from becoming too stagnant and moldy, an architectural wisdom we have only recently rediscovered. Every autumn, the entire family would work together to apply new layers of daub, turning their home into a warmer cocoon, ready for the coming winter. Above their heads was the roof, a giant organic blanket made of thick bundles of reed or straw. It was not perfect. After a few seasons of rain and sun, it would begin to leak, and sometimes it became a cozy home for small creatures like mice or birds. But it was a fantastic layer of insulation from above, preventing precious warmth from escaping. Repairing the roof was also a village affair, where the most skilled would climb up, patching holes with new bundles of straw. It is a beautiful image of mutual support, where the safety of one roof was the responsibility of all. And beneath their feet was the floor. No tile, no wood, just packed earth. The cold from the ground seeped up relentlessly, and this was one of the greatest challenges. To counter it, they turned their floor into a natural insulating cushion. A thick layer of straw, sometimes as deep as one's hand, was spread evenly across the floor. Walking on it, you would feel a softness, hear a gentle rustle, and smell the scent of the countryside. This straw was not just for comfort. It created thousands of tiny air pockets, insulating their bodies from the cold ground. On important feast days, the old straw would be swept out and replaced with a fresh, fragrant layer, sometimes mixed with aromatic herbs like lavender or mint, bringing a rare sense of renewal. As a historian, I see a profound difference in the philosophy of living. Our modern homes are sealed boxes, an attempt to completely separate ourselves from nature. Their home was a part of nature. It was made of earth and plants, and it breathed with the seasons. They did not seek to conquer nature. They sought to live in harmony with it, using the very gifts nature provided to protect themselves from its harshness. The sound of the wind whistling through a crack was not an annoyance. It was a reminder of the world outside and the preciousness of the warmth within. The smell of wood smoke and livestock was not a stench. It was the smell of life, of existence. This single living space also forged an intense community bond that we have largely lost. There were no private rooms, no closed doors. Everyone shared everything: space, food, warmth, and stories. On long winter nights, when the farm work was done, the entire family would gather together. The grandmother would tell fairy tales. The father would mend his tools. The mother would patch a tunic, and the children would listen, their eyes bright in the firelight. They lived in a state of absolute closeness, where joys and sorrows were shared instantly. It was a sacrifice of privacy, but a richness of emotion and connection. This house, with all its imperfections, was their first and most important fortress. It is a testament to their cleverness, their adaptability, and their unending spirit. It was built from the simplest of things but was reinforced with a priceless material: the love and support of a family. But even the most clever fortress will fall if there is no beating heart at its center. And in every medieval hut, that heart was not made of flesh and blood. It was made of fire. Let us move closer together toward the soul of the home, the most important, most perilous, and also the most magical place: the hearth. And in every medieval hut, that heart was not made of flesh and blood. It was made of fire. Let us move closer together toward the soul of the home, the most important, most perilous, and also the most magical place: the hearth. It was not a modern fireplace, encased in brick with a neat chimney and a safe glass door. The medieval hearth was simply a circle of stones laid directly on the dirt floor, often in the very center of the single room. This central placement was not accidental. It was an act of profound wisdom. Placed in the middle, the fire could radiate a little bit of warmth in all directions, offering a small share to everyone huddled in the cramped space. This fire was a small, multifaceted, and deeply contradictory deity. It was the giver of life. It brought warmth, the most precious commodity in winter, warding off the biting cold that lurked just outside the walls. It brought light, banishing the primal darkness and the fear that came with it. In a world without electricity, the fire was an artificial sun, the only source of light after sunset. It was also the kitchen, where the monotonous pottage was boiled, turning hard root vegetables into something edible, staving off hunger. Most importantly, the hearth was the social center, the stage for all family life. It was here, around this warm circle of stones, that stories were told. Legends of saints, fairy tales of sprites, or simple gossip about a neighbor's harvest. In a society where most could not read, this was their library, their cinema, their news channel. They didn't just look at the fire, they looked through it, seeing in the dancing flames the images of their own imagination. This is an emotional trigger of connection, a human warmth that we, with our individual screens, have perhaps lost. But this small deity was also a source of peril. As a historian, I must emphasize a detail often overlooked. Most peasant huts had no chimney. A chimney was an expensive and complex invention, reserved for castles and the homes of the nobility. So where did the smoke go? The answer is everywhere. The smoke rose, curling up beneath the thatched roof, searching for a way out through a small hole in the ceiling or through the cracks in the walls. This turned their living space into a perpetual smokehouse. Everything, from their clothes and hair to their very lungs, was imbued with the smell of smoke. It stunned the eyes, caused chronic coughs, and led to respiratory diseases. Ironically, the very thing that kept them alive through the cold was also slowly harming them. But they accepted this trade-off because a night without fire was far more terrifying than a life with smoke. An unintended side effect of the thick smoke was that it helped to drive away insects and other pests, turning the hut into a less than friendly environment for uninvited guests. Another risk was fire itself. The roof was made of dry straw, just a few meters above the open hearth. A single errant spark could turn their entire home, their only asset, to ash in minutes. Tending the fire was a responsibility of the highest order, and to maintain that fire, they needed fuel. This was another daily struggle. Wood was not always available. The great forests often belonged to the Lord, and entering to chop down a tree could be considered a serious crime. So, The peasants gathered whatever they could burn: dry twigs, peat, and even dried animal dung. The anxiety over running out of fuel was as constant as the anxiety over running out of food. The hearth, therefore, was not just an object. It was a relationship. The family had to care for it, feed it, understand its temperament. They had to know which wood burned the longest, how to stack the fuel to allow for airflow, and how to control the flames so they were not too large nor too small. But the greatest challenge was not starting the fire, but keeping it from dying out during the 14 hours of a long winter's night. Rekindling a fire from scratch in the freezing morning was an incredibly difficult and costly task, both in time and resources. And so they invented an art, a secret passed down through the smoke of generations, a testament to their incredible survival wisdom. That is the art of banking the fire. And in every medieval hut, that heart was not made of flesh and blood. It was made of fire. Let us move closer together toward the soul of the home, the most important, most perilous, and also the most magical place: the hearth. But this heart was incredibly fragile. The warmth it bestowed was a precious gift, but not a free one. It demanded care, understanding, and constant vigilance. The greatest, most dramatic challenge was not starting the fire, but keeping it from dying out during the 14 hours of a long winter's night. Imagine the desperation of waking up in a hut as cold as ice, the fire dead. Rekindling a fire from scratch was no simple task. You had no matches, no lighter. You had only 2 pieces of flint, a small piece of steel, and something called tinder, perhaps a piece of dried fungus or moss that had been carefully prepared. You would have to sit in the dark, your fingers numb with cold, trying to strike the stones together to create a single spark, a fragile, fleeting spark. Then you had to deftly catch that spark in the tinder, blowing gently, patiently, praying for it to catch. It was a task that required skill, persistence, and luck. One small mistake, and you would fail. A failure meant no warmth, no hot breakfast, and a start to the day in cold and disappointment. For this reason, medieval peasants invented an art, a secret passed down through the smoke of generations, a testament to their incredible survival wisdom. That is the art of banking the fire. This was not a chore. This was a nightly ritual, often performed by the eldest woman in the house, the grandmother or mother, the keeper of the hearth's wisdom. As the family prepared for sleep, the fire would be allowed to burn down, leaving only a bed of glowing embers, looking like a carpet of glittering stars. That was the soul of the fire, the life that needed to be protected. Then, the woman would carefully use a stick to gently gather the hottest embers into the center. And then she would take out the most important ingredient, ash. The fine, gray ash from previous days' fires was not waste. It was a perfect insulating blanket. She would take small handfuls of ash and slowly cover the glowing embers. This was a delicate dance, a perfect balance. Too little ash, and the air would get in, causing the embers to burn out before midnight. Too much, and the fire would suffocate and die completely. She had to create a covering just thick enough to restrict the air, but thin enough to preserve the intense heat within. As a historian, I see this as an incredibly intuitive application of science. By covering the embers with ash, they limited the oxygen supply, slowing the combustion process to a near standstill. It didn't extinguish the fire, It put the fire into a state of hibernation, preserving its potential energy for many hours. When the task was complete, the hearth was no longer a dancing flame. It was just a silent, gray mound of ash, seemingly lifeless. The family went to sleep, entrusting all their hopes to that silent mound. During the night, a father or an older son might awaken, feeling the cold deepen in the hut. He would quietly approach the hearth, listen, and perhaps add another thin layer of ash, like a mother pulling a blanket over a sleeping child. And then, the most dramatic moment came in the morning. As the first light filtered through the cracks, the hut was freezing. The mother would be the first to approach the mound of ash. The whole family would watch with bated breath. She would gently use a stick to push aside the top layer of ash. And there, deep within, a faint orange-red glow, weak but still vibrant, revealed itself. It was a small miracle, a quiet victory against the night and the cold. A collective sigh of relief would ripple through the room. They had succeeded. From that single glowing ember, the mother would deftly place the smallest, driest twigs, glowing gently, and the flame would slowly be reborn, flaring up once more to welcome the new day. This ritual of banking the fire held a deeper meaning. It was a symbol of continuity, of hope. It taught the children patience, care, and the importance of preserving what one has. The fire passed from one day to the next was like life itself, passed from one generation to the next. The fire has been revived, a promise of warmth for the new day. But it is just a tiny island of life in a frozen ocean of a hut. Its light and warmth cannot reach every corner, especially the far edges where the children sleep. So, what was their second secret? How did they spread that precious warmth to every family member? The answer lies not in technology, but in the most primal of human instincts: closeness. They turned their own bodies into mobile hearths. They turned their own bodies into mobile hearths. This is not an image of deprivation. This is an image of primal wisdom, a deep and instinctual understanding of a simple law of physics. Sharing creates abundance. A single body alone in the cold night loses heat rapidly, but multiple bodies, clustered together, create a microclimate, an oasis of warmth in a desert of cold. The fire has been revived, a promise of warmth for the new day. But it is just a tiny island of life in a frozen ocean of a hut. Its light and heat can only reach so far, leaving the distant corners of the room steeped in darkness and chill. So, what was their second secret? How did they spread that precious warmth to every family member? The answer lies not in technology, but in the most primal of human instincts: closeness. As night fell and the hearth was banked into a silent mound of ash, a quiet dance would begin. The entire family would move to one corner of the hut, where the straw was thickest, and prepare for sleep. But they did not sleep as individuals. They slept as one. Imagine the scene. On a single straw mattress large enough for the whole family, a living blanket was formed. This was no random huddle. It was a calculated and loving arrangement. In the center, the warmest and most protected position, were the most vulnerable, the youngest children and the frail elderly. The small bodies of children lose heat quickly, while the elderly struggle to generate enough warmth on their own. They were placed in the core of this human fortress, enveloped by healthier, stronger bodies. The next layer, wrapping around them, consisted of the parents and older siblings. They became human shields, using their own body heat to protect their loved ones from the drafts that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The person on the outermost edge had the most difficult position, one side of their body warmed by contact with another, the other side cold as it faced the air of the room. There were unwritten rules. Don't move too much lest you let the cold air in, and share the single woolen cloak fairly. As a historian, I see this as a powerful emotional trigger, one that touches upon our deep-seated yearning for connection. In the modern world, we have our own bedrooms, our own beds, and sometimes our own separate lives. We value privacy, but they were different. In that absolute lack of personal space, they found something that we often search for, the feeling of never being alone. In the deep darkness, you could hear every breath of your loved ones. Your father's soft snores, your mother's sleepy murmurs, your siblings even breathing as their head rested on your arm. It was a symphony of life, an affirmation that you were part of a whole. Safety came not from sturdy walls, but from the warmth of skin, from the trust that someone was right there beside you, facing the night with you. It was in this enforced intimacy that family bonds became stronger than ever. This was when stories were whispered. A grandmother might retell a fairy tale she heard from her own grandmother. A father might speak of a hard day's labor, or a dream of a bountiful harvest. Fears and hopes were shared in the dark, soothed by the warmth of this small community. This was where oral culture was nurtured, where the family's legacy was passed down not through books, but through every story, every breath. This simple act of sleeping together became a healing ritual. It banished the fear of the dark, of the cold, of solitude. It reminded each individual that they were an indispensable link in a chain. The survival of one depended on the survival of all. But the warmth of humans is a miracle, yet it was still not enough to completely banish the chill of a winter's night, especially when the hut itself was still so large compared to the small, living blanket of the family. They needed allies, and those allies did not always walk on two legs. In their survival strategy, the medieval peasant invited into their home some unwilling roommates, some natural, noisy, and sometimes quite messy heating machines. Their livestock. They turned their own bodies into mobile hearths. But even the warmest blanket woven from human kinship has its limits. In a hut where the cold wind still finds a way to whisper through the walls, the warmth of human bodies is a miracle, but it is not enough to completely banish the chill of a winter's night. They needed allies, and those allies did not always walk on two legs. In their survival strategy, the medieval peasant invited into their home some unwilling roommates, some natural, noisy, and sometimes quite messy heating machines. Their livestock. To us, this is an unimaginable image, a mixture of the unsanitary and the bizarre. But to them, this was a life or death decision, a wordless covenant signed between human and beast. Understand that these animals were not just pets. They were the family's most precious assets. The cow was not just an animal. It was the daughter's dowry, the insurance policy against a hungry winter, the pulling power for next year's crop. The pig was the reserve of fat and meat for the rare feast days. The chickens were diligent egg-laying machines, providing a valuable source of protein. To lose an animal to the winter cold or a predator was not just a sadness. It was an economic catastrophe that could push the entire family to the brink of desperation. Therefore, on the coldest winter nights, a small migration would take place. The hut door would be opened, and the four-legged friends would amble inside. The cow, with its large body and complex digestive system constantly radiating a significant amount of heat, would be given a sheltered corner, often against the coldest wall. It became a living radiator, a mobile shield, giving off a steady and pleasant warmth. The pig, with its thick layer of fat, was also an excellent heat source and would often find a spot near the hearth, grunting with satisfaction. The chickens would find perches on the high rafters or in old baskets, turning into fluffy, warm orbs suspended in the air. As a historian, I see this as more than just a practical solution. It reflects a completely different relationship between humans and animals. In the modern world, we draw a clear line. This is human space. That is animal space. For them, that boundary was erased by necessity. Humans and livestock shared a space, a warmth, a struggle to exist. They were not master and servant. They were housemates in the confrontation with winter. Imagine the symphony of the night in that hut. The crackle of the fire has died down, leaving only the silent mound of ash. In its place, you hear the steady, slow chewing of the cow's cud, the grunting of the pig, occasionally snorting in its sleep, the soft clucking of the chickens from above, and woven through it all, the breathing of humans. This was not an annoying noise. This was the sound of life, an affirmation that in this tiny hut, many hearts were beating together, radiating heat together, holding back the cold outside together. The feeling of being near a large, warm creature like a cow in the deep of night could bring a strange comfort. Its hot breath puffed out in steamy clouds, a visible reminder of the life that continued on. It brought not only physical warmth but also a sense of psychological security. Of course, this cohabitation had its price. The aroma in the hut, already complex, was now enriched with the deep, earthy notes of livestock. The packed earth floor became a potential minefield in the morning, and your sleep could be disturbed by a sudden moo or a gentle nudge from a furry roommate. But the medieval peasant accepted this trade-off with incredible wisdom. They understood a simple rule: the cold can take a life, but a bad smell cannot. A little inconvenience was a small price to pay for the safety of their family and their most valuable assets. They had a fortress built of mud and wisdom. They had a fiery heart preserved by the art of banking. They had a living blanket woven from kinship. And now they had four-legged allies, mobile heating units. Their home was now as warm as it could possibly be. But that fortress was not enough. They needed a second layer of armor, a mobile defense that they wore on their very own bodies, a final layer of protection in the unending confrontation with winter. That was their clothing. And those allies did not always walk on two legs. In their survival strategy, the medieval peasant invited into their home some unwilling roommates, some natural, noisy, and sometimes quite messy heating machines. Their livestock. They had turned their hut into a warm fortress, an ecosystem of shared life. But that fortress was stationary. When they had to step outside to face the biting winds in the fields or the forest, they needed a personal armor, a mobile fortress. And that was their clothing. When we speak of medieval fashion, please do not think of lavish gowns or velvet cloaks. That is the world of the nobility. The fashion of the peasant had no name. It had only one purpose: to keep you from dying of cold. Their philosophy was incredibly simple and effective: layering. They understood instinctively that wearing multiple thin layers was warmer than one thick layer, because the air trapped between the fabrics is the best insulator of all. The innermost layer, if you were lucky, was a linen under tunic. Linen is softer and absorbs sweat better than wool, but for many, the innermost layer was simply yesterday's outer layer. The main garment was a coarse wool tunic. This wool was not soft. It was scratchy and rough, but it was a magical material. Wool has the ability to retain warmth even when damp, a priceless quality in the wet and snowy climate of Europe. Over the tunic might be a cloak or a patched-up sheepskin. Their legs were wrapped in strips of wool, and they wore simple wooden clogs or shoes of untreated leather. But here lies the most surprising secret, an emotional trigger that challenges all our modern notions of cleanliness. One of their most effective tools for staying warm was filth. As a historian, I want to clarify this. This was not laziness. It was a calculated survival strategy. As we've discussed, doing laundry in winter was incredibly difficult and risky. But beyond that, they had realized something miraculous. A clean woolen garment, with its fluffy, porous fibers, allows the cold wind to pass through easily. But a woolen tunic that has been worn for weeks, for months, accumulates a layer of natural body oils and the lanolin inherent in untreated wool. This organic patina, combined with dirt, clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, turning the garment into a nearly waterproof and wind-resistant shell. It was like a medieval version of Gore-Tex, only a bit smellier. And regarding the smell, we must understand that their concept of body odor was completely different from ours. In a world where everything had a scent, the smell of smoke, earth, animals, decay, the scent of a healthy, laboring body was not shameful. It was the smell of life, the fragrant cleanliness we are obsessed with today is a very recent invention. To them, a lack of smell might have been more alarming, a potential sign of sickness or death. And so, they wore their armor of practicality. This multi-layered clothing, weatherproofed naturally by life itself, created a cocoon around their bodies. This protection was also applied to the most vulnerable parts. A simple woolen cap, called a coif, was essential, as most body heat escapes through the head. Hands were kept warm with fingerless mittens made from scraps of fabric, and the feet, perhaps the part that suffered the most, were protected by tightly wound strips of cloth, called winnigiz, a technique that required skill to provide warmth without cutting off circulation. All of this paints a picture that is not beautiful, but is incredibly effective. It shows a deep understanding of materials and the environment. They did not have science, but they had experience. They did not have technology, but they had observation. And there is a healing aspect to this. Wearing the same clothes every day creates an extraordinary sense of familiarity. That garment carries the shape of your body, the scent of you, your family, your home. In a harsh, unpredictable world, it was a constant, a shell not just physically, but psychologically. It was your cocoon. They had turned their bodies into a warm cocoon, wrapped in layers of fabric and practical wisdom. They did everything they could to preserve every precious bit of heat their bodies generated. But when night fell and the temperature dropped profoundly, when the cold didn't just come from the air but seeped up from the ground, even the thickest cocoon was not enough. They needed an active heat source, a small miracle to carry into their sleep, to confront the invisible adversary from below. Their wisdom did not stop at clothing. It extended to turning the most ordinary things, food and stones, into personal heating devices. And in the unending confrontation with winter, that was their clothing. They had turned their bodies into a warm cocoon, wrapped in layers of fabric and practical wisdom. But when night fell and the temperature dropped profoundly, when the cold didn't just come from the air but seeped up from the ground. Even the thickest cocoon was not enough. They needed an active heat source, a small miracle to carry into their sleep, to confront the invisible adversary from below. Their wisdom did not stop at clothing. It extended to turning the most ordinary things, food and stones, into personal heating devices. Let us begin with the furnace from within. The medieval peasant, through generations of observation, had learned something that modern science would later call diet-induced thermogenesis. Simply put, a full stomach generates warmth. The process of digesting food, especially foods that require a lot of energy to break down, automatically produces heat, warming the body from the inside. Therefore, the last meal of the day was not just to quell hunger. It was part of the strategy for preparing for sleep. It was when they fueled their internal furnace. The evening meal was often the most substantial of the day, not out of luxury, but out of necessity. The pottage would be thicker, cooked with more whole grains like barley and oats. These grains digest slowly, releasing energy and warmth gradually throughout the long night. If it was a lucky day, after a feast or when a pig had been slaughtered, the meal would include a piece of salted pork or sausage. The fat within was a dense source of energy, a high-grade charcoal for their biological furnace. As a historian, I see this as a profound emotional trigger. The evening meal was not just physically significant, it was psychologically significant. In a world full of uncertainty, a full belly provided a rare sense of security and comfort. It was a small victory before entering the nightly confrontation with the dark. The family would gather, sharing a hot meal, feeling the warmth of the food spread through their bodies. It was a healing ritual, a moment of peace before the cold descended. But warmth from the inside was not enough. They needed a warm companion, an external heat source to banish the chill that seeped through the straw mattress. And they found it not in a complex technology, but in something humble and eternal, a stone. The ritual of the hot stone was one of their most brilliant and touching inventions. Before bed, a member of the family, often one of the older children, would be tasked with selecting a few flat, smooth stones from outside. These stones would then be placed at the edge of the hearth, right on the glowing embers that were being prepared for baking. The family would watch the stones. They slowly absorbed the heat of the fire, turning from a cool gray to a darker shade. And if left long enough, they would emit a faint orange-red glow in the dark. It was a magical moment when a lifeless, cold object was imbued with the life of the fire. When the stones were hot enough, a careful operation began. Using 2 sticks or thick rags, the searingly hot stones were retrieved from the hearth. They were then meticulously wrapped in multiple layers of old cloth. This wrapping was crucial. It not only prevented burns, but also helped the stone to radiate its heat more slowly and over a longer period. This warm heart of stone would then be placed where it was needed most, deep within the straw mattress, usually at the foot of the bed. It became a personal heating device, a small sun that radiated a gentle, persistent warmth for hours. That warmth would slowly spread through the straw, chasing away the cold of the earth, warming their freezing feet, and bringing an indescribable sense of comfort. All of these strategies did not exist in isolation. They were a system, a defensive network woven from wisdom. The well-daubed hut. Part 1. Reduced heat loss. The banked fire. Part 3. Provided the embers for the stones. The family huddled together, Part 4, and brought in the livestock. Part 5, to maximize body heat. The layered clothing. Part 6, protected each individual. And finally, the hearty meal and the hot stone. Part 7, provided active sources of new heat. It was a symphony of survival, where each element supported the others. They had mastered the material world. They had used their wisdom to turn the simplest things into tools for survival. But facing the endless darkness and the frightening silence of a winter's night, when the cold was not just a physical sensation but a fear of mortality, they needed one final layer of armor. An armor for the spirit. And that armor was woven from two invisible yet incredibly strong threads: community and faith. Their wisdom did not stop at clothing. It extended to turning the most ordinary things, food and stones, into personal heating devices. They had mastered the material. They had used their wisdom to turn mud into a fortress, fire into a living heart, their bodies into a living blanket, and their livestock into warm companions. They had done everything physically possible to survive, but facing the endless darkness and the frightening silence of a winter's night, when the cold was not just a physical sensation but a fear of mortality, a fear of the void, they needed one final layer of armor, an armor for the spirit. And that armor was woven from two invisible yet incredibly strong threads: community and faith. Let us speak of the first thread, community. In the Middle Ages, no one survived winter alone. Survival was not an individual effort. It was a village project. When winter descended, their small village was not just a collection of huts. It became a single living organism, contracting together to withstand the cold. There was an unwritten system of watchfulness, a silent but incredibly effective form of care. Everyone kept an eye on each other. If smoke failed to rise from old Thomas's roof one morning, it wasn't just his private business. It was an alarm bell for the whole village. Someone would go and knock, not out of nosiness, but out of responsibility. They did this because they knew that tomorrow, the one needing that knock on the door could be them. When a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A neighbor would not hesitate to scoop a glowing coal from their own hearth, carefully wrap it in rags and leaves, and run through the snow to deliver that gift of life. The act of sharing an ember was more than sharing warmth. It was sharing the heart of one's own home, an act of the deepest compassion. As a historian, I see this relationship not as pure altruism, but as a system of reciprocal survival. Today I help you, because tomorrow I might need your help. It was a social contract written not in ink, but in action, in the trust that in the confrontation with nature, humans could only rely on other humans. And the second thread, perhaps the strongest, was Astor's faith. In a world of uncertainty, where science could not explain why winter was so harsh, faith was not an abstract concept. It was an effective survival tool, an anchor for the soul. Faith gave them a structure and a meaning for their suffering. Their prayers were not empty words. They were incredibly specific and practical. They did not pray for riches. They prayed, "Lord, please keep our fire from going out. St. Nicholas, please protect our home through the storm. St. Francis, please watch over our livestock." The saints were not distant figures. They were specialized patrons, divine companions in every aspect of life. Alongside prayers were rituals and even superstitions. People might sprinkle a little holy water in the corner of the hut to ward off cold spirits, or use blessed chalk to draw a protective symbol on the door. These actions, while having no physical effect, had immense psychological power. It gave them a sense of agency, a feeling that they were doing something, that they were not completely helpless before unseen forces. Most importantly, faith gave them hope. The church calendar, with its cycle of feasts, gave winter an endpoint. They knew that after the long, dark months of Advent and Christmas would come Easter, a celebration of rebirth, coinciding with the return of spring. The hope of spring was more than a wish for warmer weather. It was a deep spiritual belief that light would always overcome darkness, that life would always rise from death. That hope became their spiritual fuel, helping them endure the longest nights. And so, these two threads were woven together. Community was the horizontal support from person to person. Faith was the vertical support from humanity up to the divine. Together, they created an invisible armor, enveloping their souls, protecting them from falling into despair. And so, winter after winter, they endured, they persisted, they survived. They passed on their secrets of survival and the flame of life to their children. But perhaps the greatest legacy they left is not how they survived, but why they persevered. The answer to that, why, holds the deepest lesson for all of us, the inheritors of the world they built from their very resilience. And in the silence of the medieval night, the answer begins to appear, not from kings or battles, but from the incredible, unbelievable resilience of human beings. Our journey, thankfully, was a fleeting dream, a dream from which we can awaken. Feel the difference. There is no cold earth floor, only the familiar support of a mattress. There is no sound of wind whistling through cracks in the wall, only the quiet stillness of a modern home. We have returned. As we awaken in this safety, the real question is not, how did they live, but what can we learn from them? This is where, based on the stark facts from the original video, I want to use my perspective as a historian to distill with you some profound lessons. Lessons not just for knowing, but for living. The first, and perhaps most healing gift, is the power of profound gratitude. Our world is complex. We are caught in the current of the 24/7 news cycle, the pressures of work, the worries about finances and the future. We feel tired, but this journey gives us a new lens through which to see our fatigue. Our hardships are those of complexity. Their hardships were those of survival. They did not worry about the stock market. They worried about whether the fire would go out in the middle of the night. They were not stressed by a meeting. They were stressed that a child's cough could be a prelude to death. Their story is a potent antidote to the anxieties of modern life. It teaches us a lesson in perspective. The next time you feel overwhelmed, try this. Go to a faucet and turn it on. Watch the clear, clean, cool water flow out. Think for a moment of its value. The next time you flip a switch and a room is filled with light, feel the magic in that. The next time you take a simple pain reliever, remember the barber surgeon and his iron pliers. Gratitude is not about ignoring the challenges of the present. It is about placing those challenges in a grander context. It is the recognition that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, nameless giants who endured not just so they could survive, but so that we, centuries later, could have the peace of mind they never knew. The second lesson, no less profound, is about rediscovering our village. One of the great paradoxes of our time is that we are more connected than ever technologically, yet we often feel more isolated than ever. The story of the medieval peasant reveals the opposite truth. They had no privacy, but they had presence. They lived in a covenant of mutual reliance. They knew that no one could get through the winter alone. Their strength was in keeping an eye on a neighbor's chimney, in the willingness to share a glowing ember, in huddling together in the dark. Their village was not a choice, it was a lifeline. What is the lesson for us? It is an invitation to intentionally build our own villages. It may not be about sharing a hut, but it is about picking up the phone to call an old friend. It may not be about carrying hot coals to a neighbor, but it is about bringing them a meal when they are unwell. It is about setting aside our distractions to truly listen to the stories of our children and grandchildren. In a world that is increasingly distant, the act of fostering community, however small, becomes a radical and necessary act of healing. And the final lesson, a lesson for those of us who think about legacy, is about the value of endurance. The peasant of the 14th century did not know about us. They could not imagine a world of electricity, antibiotics, or the internet. They were not struggling for a grand future they could envision. They were simply enduring. They persevered through each winter, each famine, each plague, with one singular goal, so that their children could continue to live. They were a single link in a long chain of history. Their legacy was not a great monument. Their legacy was that the chain did not break. This offers a deeply meaningful message for our generation, for those of us who have lived through decades of change. Our legacy lies not only in what we build, but in what we help others endure. It lies in the resilience we model for our children, in the values we pass on. We are the living legacy of their endurance. So, as we leave this story behind, let us carry these lessons with us. Let us use our modern comforts not for complacency, but as *** platform * to live more deeply. I would be honored to hear your reflections. After walking through a day in the Middle Ages, what in your modern life makes you feel most grateful? And what is the most important value you hope to pass on to the next generation? Thank you for walking this path with me. May you sleep peacefully, wrapped not just in the comfort of your bed, but in a gratitude for the long, unbroken line of resilient souls who made this night possible.